This is where the problem is that the more you try to change people culturally without changing their material conditions, the more they will respond the opposite way.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we don't see
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast.
Fakhry Al-Serdawi is a Palestinian lawyer focused on international relations and nuclear disarmament. He is the author of Orientalism, NATO Style for Compact Magazine and Orientalism and Wokeness for Sublation Magazine. So, Fakhry, welcome to the Diet Soap podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Doug.
Yeah, your essay, Orientalism NATO Style, is I think a good part of the conversation that needs to be going on right now on the left. It was somewhat of a response to Jean's article for Compact, where he was arguing against the typical anti-imperialist line that embraces Putin as some sort of hero for socialism. But you take a different tact, basically pointing out that it's very easy to slip back and forth between a pro-NATO or pro-Putin position. And so I wanted to start by just asking you whether or not you consider Russia to be an imperialist power, and then more importantly, what is the cause of imperialism in your view?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. The question that you asked me is a question about polarization. Like, we can say that we don't want to take any side, but it's easy to slip, as you said, into one side or the other. I think that there are some international law issues with what happened in 2022 and since 2014, including the annexation of Crimea. I cannot talk about, as a Palestinian also, I cannot talk about Palestine, the West Bank in one manner, and then talk about what is happening in Ukraine in another manner. There's one international law, not two international laws or multiple international laws or regional laws for different regions of the world. It's just one. So what happened was an aggression in 2022 of February. I am not a specialist in social science myself, but I got interested in the theory of Orientalism first in 2017. Like, I started reading Edward Said in 2017 when the Culture War was beginning, and then and in the same time I was seeing Zizek and getting to know Zizek. And he was one of the few people that was providing an alternative view on Marxism back then, as opposed to cancel culture and all of that. The second time I got interested in Orientalism and in Edward Said was through my work, I work in the field of nuclear disarmament. So when after the Iran deal failed in 2016, and before that in 2015, there was a failure of another deal that no one knows about under the Obama administration, which is the zone free of nuclear weapons in the Middle East conference, that's in 2012, and there's the non-proliferation conference, which failed because of the Middle East, because of this zone under the Obama administration. So a lot of people talk about the Iran issue. Nobody talks about that under the Obama administration, which was a huge failure. So we started becoming interested as researchers in state ideology, especially nuclear state ideology. And this is where I found Hugh Gusterson, who wrote an essay about nuclear weapons and the image of the other in the West, not after 9/11, before 9/11, 1999, when there was some nuclear testing in Pakistan, India, which led to a mass hysteria on the news cycle in the West. It was the end of the world back then. So this is why I became interested in Said. I started doing my research on Cold War Orientalism, we can say, before the broader Atlantic Orientalism during the Cold War and after the Cold War. In January 4th, 2022, I had no idea that the war is going to start a month later. And I continued with that for months and months. It was a lot of material that I've seen. And, it took me until 2023 that it was published for Compact, the issue of nuclear Orientalism.
Mm-hmm. So, your piece for Compact, that, which is again entitled "Orientalism NATO Style," is well worth reading. It's very interesting the way you draw connections between the kind of Cold War era Orientalism and the Orientalism of today. Your piece, Orientalism and Wokeness, is also kind of counterintuitive and inspired me to think past the obvious, because as you say in your piece on wokeness and Orientalism, these two notions are usually thought to be opposed, but may not be. I want to get to that Sublation magazine article in a bit, but the reason what I asked you to start was, what do you think is the cause of imperialism? Yeah. And I guess what I'll follow up with is, do you think that various kinds of Orientalism are what creates the impetus for imperial action, imperialism?
That's a good question to say no, and to start talking about Edward Said and Marxism. So that's a very good question to really start the conversation and go into both articles. So the first article is a Cold War article, and the second article obviously is a War on Terror article, which continues till now and continues domestically within the U.S., which is something that I'm going to talk about later. And even Glenn Greenwald, when January 6th happened, started to draw upon the continuation. But to answer your question, Orientalism does not lead to imperialism. And this is the first criticism against Said from Marxists. So some Marxists, not much Marxists, discredited Edward Said completely, and some Marxists built upon what he said, because what he said was important. So the book Orientalism came out in 1978. It came out in a very dangerous era. First of all, you had the revolution in Iran that was taking place. And second, you had the, let's say, the neoliberal revolution. Economies post-colonial states were opening up to neoliberalism. Let's see about that deal, what we're going to do about that. And when it came out, there was a lot of controversy for different reasons. But Arab Marxists were very worried about it because it would give ammunition to Islamists who rose during 1980s and 1990s as a force and as a social force within the Middle Eastern communities and across the borders. Of course, Arab Marxists were against their project. But the problem with those Islamists is that they were anti-statist. So, on the other hand, liberals were becoming more and more statist because of the Islamic scare in the 1980s and 1990s. What Arab Marxists done, like Sadiq Jalal al-Azim, was building upon the theory of Said instead of discrediting, because it was thought that Said have sublimed an important state ideology, imperialist ideology, that was very important in understanding where capitalism were getting to. Like I said, I was reading Zizek and I was reading Said in the same time. The real problem with Orientalism is not that it leads to imperialism. It explains it and it mystifies it. And it explains and mystifies something more important, which is capitalism. So Samir Amin, Egyptian Marxist, also built upon Said and said that the problem with Eurocentrism, the problem with Orientalism, is that it makes capitalism permanent. Instead of saying that capitalism would lead to socialism or barbarism, it would make us choose between capitalism or barbarism. Going back to Cold War Orientalism, it was starting in the atomic age when Truman started building the idea that the world out there is dangerous. So until now, there is the idea that the world out there is dangerous. And this is the problem with Eurocentrism and Orientalism. Instead of focusing on the contradiction of capitalism itself, it searches for a contradiction that exists outside of capital. And this is why Marxists thought that Said's theory was important. But one of the criticisms of Said's theory is that he thought that thoughts about the Orient would lead to imperialism. No, it is historical material reasons that would lead to imperialism, not thoughts about Orientalism. Thoughts about Orientalism would come later, after capitalism has expanded itself.
Yeah, one of the things that I pulled out from your essay for Compact, it reminded me of Zizek when I was reading it, and because he has a critique of anti-totalitarianism, and it seems like I picked up that critique here. You wrote that. Well, so just to kind of, I want to put this quote in context if I can first, and tell me if I'm getting this correct. The specter of totalitarianism had an Oriental character during the Cold War. That the Orient was totalitarian. And even when the totalitarianism was arising in Europe, those like Mussolini or Hitler who embraced totalitarianism were thought to be maybe regressing below the level of the West, or were somehow foreign to the West, or taking up ideas that from the Orient, or somehow or another not living up to the Western ideal. And so it is in that context where totalitarianism is Orientalized that you wrote. And am I getting that roughly right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There is one of my resources that I cannot find here was that there was a sense. There was Orientalism within the heart of the anti-totalitarian theory. One of the writers, William Pietz. William Pietz wrote about how anti-totalitarianism, within the heart of anti-totalitarianism, there was the idea of Oriental despotism, the perfect villain, let's say, which comes from the Orient. This villain was created when capitalism was being created. Montesquieu, when he wrote about the spirit of the laws and wrote about private property, and by the way, none of the two articles that I wrote are critical race theory articles.
No, yeah.
I just want to say that. But there was a necessity for Montesquieu to find the other and to compare the other with the self when it comes to the radical bourgeois thinking. When there was a regressive situation happening in Europe in the time of Montesquieu, and there was some, the French monarchy was becoming absolutist. Montesquieu started comparing it to the Oriental reader. There is no private property in the Orient. This is what Montesquieu thought. The Oriental leader leads with fear, and everybody under them is a slave. And that's why colonialism and imperialism would be a better thing than the Oriental despot, by the way, answering the previous question. Mm-hmm. So that turned out not to be true. That was discredited. Mm-hmm. And there was another theorist, I will murder his name, Abraham du Pion, who discredited Montesquieu on that and said that he went to Persia, he went to Hindustan, and he thought that there were some complex legal systems there. Now, the theory of the Oriental despot was rehashed, and it was rehashed to explain Stalinism. Mm-hmm. So Stalinism, there are a lot of explanations on Stalinism, which that includes Trotskyists that are historical material, but the anti-totalitarians, or one of the big names in anti-totalitarians, like George Kennan, George Orwell, Hannah Arendt, said that.
This is what I wanted to. What I wanted to ask you, because I'd actually written it. This is what you wrote in your article. You said, indeed, anti-totalitarianism participated alongside Stalinism in the liquidation of historical possibilities.
Yeah.
But from the liberal Atlanticist perspective.
Yeah.
You write, you go on to say Hitler might have been geographically inside Europe, but his barbarous actions belong to the non-European world. Once again, Euro-Orientalism proved useful for casting the internal enemy as an outsider.
Yeah.
For anti-totalitarian thinkers like George Orwell, George Kennan, Hannah Arendt, Arthur Koestler, Nazism and fascism weren't the logical conclusions of Europe's internal political and economic crisis, because those totalitarian ideologies were inherently un-Western.
Yeah.
So, I what I wrote underneath that was: would you argue that capitalism is Western, or is it Oriental?
I will go to that. Thank you very much, because I was saved by the bill, your bill. I was a little bit. So yeah, they explained Stalinism that it's especially Kennan, which, you know, I do like Kennan because he was an anti-capitalist conservative. Kennan in one of the documents establishing Cold War consensus, which is the long telegram, talked about how Stalinism came because of the Russian Oriental mentality, and this is really the heart of Orientalism within the Cold War consensus, as a striking example. In the same time, they were having similar explanations on the crisis of Nazism and fascism. That, and this is what I call it, is Orientalizing Hitler. So first, during World War II and after World War II, Hitler was Orientalized. He was un-Western. And after that, Oriental leaders were Hitlerized. For example, the book of Jamal Abdel Nasser, Philosophy of the Revolution, was considered by some Western media like Mein Kampf during the 1956 Suez Canal. It was a political situation. They politicized it that way. So capitalism, to answer your question, and I go back to Samir Amin, who's a brilliant, you can't read Orientalism without reading Eurocentrism 1993 by Samir Amin. Capitalism appeared in the West for historical material reasons. You know, the age of discovery, the ship routes, Westphalia, all that. A lot of Marxiologists will explain this better than me, why capitalism appeared in the West. But it did not appear in the West for a centralized metaphysical reason. Race, which is mostly a Mediterranean race. Christianity, which is also an Oriental religion, or Islam is an Occidental religion, the way you see it. And many other mystifying reasons. Once again, the problem with Eurocentrism is that it mystifies why capital appeared in Europe, it makes capitalism a non-universal category.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I read this section of your article in Compact, and I of course completely agree that you can't in good faith Orientalize Hitler, and that the failure of the Soviet Union cannot be explained by pointing to the mentality of the Russians. But I felt you were hard on George Orwell, and maybe there's something to the anti-totalitarian critique of the Soviet Union that we want to hold on to, especially right now. It seems to me that while the anti-communist Cold War liberals aren't to be fully embraced, if there's something to be taken up from that they had, it might be this anti-totalitarian perspective, not the Orientalist perspective, but the desire to embrace liberalism.
Yeah.
Because right now we're living through a time where we're being asked to acclimate to Western totalitarianism. And I would say that the totalitarianism of the East and of the West may have some superficial differences, but they are disappearing.
Exactly.
Even on that level, the West is quickly, it's like not an early adopter, but it's adopting the kind of smartphone totalitarianism that we used to think of as Chinese, and so on. So I just wanted to ask you if you think that if we can embrace aspects of what's called the West or liberal ideology or even Atlanticist ideology, the way that people want to self-conceive in the West, and as a way to combat the reality of the imperialism, not the Orientalism that is taking hold in the West, which I think includes this war on the domestic population. That's my...
Yeah, I mean, Chris Cutrone said it. What if the West is more totalitarian than the Soviet system was ever dreamt to be? But I mean, like I said, it's very easy to slip in one way or the other. George Orwell was one of, I'm not discrediting him completely, or it's just a critique. I think he tried to draw a map of how totalitarianism looks like. He used English socialism. He didn't use Russian socialism or Arab socialism in his novel. But the problem with, I'm not going to say Western totalitarianism, but let's not talk about geographical area, but totalitarianism in the age of late capitalism. The problem with it is that it's tacit. Let's go back to 1978 and 1979 and the 80s and the end of the 80s. For you, I know, Doug, that one of the most important things for you and for many of, if you're working in research, is free speech. And the 9/11 free speech was the Salman Rushdie affair. And you can say that the other 9/11 free speech was Charlie Hebdo. Now, there is a very good, very, very good Sunit Singh article in Sublation about the issue of Salman Rushdie. About even the mass hysteria of Marxists, third world Marxists, who were seeing Iran as the next phase of anti-imperialism and third worldism back then. And that's very documented in Sunit Singh article at Sublation. The problem is that it wasn't a crisis of Islamism, it was a crisis of cultural war back then. There was also mass hysteria on the liberal side. What happened with Salman Rushdie proved that the world out there is dangerous. That's why we should follow the neoliberal thesis. It's the only alternative. It's the end of history, and so on and so forth. to the extent that they were blinded to see where we're going. The fact that jihadists were being funded in Afghanistan and the fall of the Soviet Union didn't only lead to regression, social regression within the Soviet sphere, but within the third world sphere in the Middle East. Communist parties, some of them have some Stalinist thinking. I know they're not perfect, but they shrunk after all over the world after the fall of the Soviet Union. And then you had 9/11, and then you had the national security state, and then the attack on free speech. You know, the attack on free speech in the Salman Rushdie affair is flamboyant.
Well, that was before 9/11.
No, I know that was before 9/11, but I was saying that the attack on free speech in the Salman Rushdie affair was, let's say, flamboyant. It was sexy. It was, but the tacit attack on free speech was lurking, and the left didn't see that. And this is what I tried to say in my Compact magazine article, that there's mass hysteria on the side of people who are saying that Russia's anti-imperialist, but there is mass hysteria on the people who are saying that socialism would come out of the Ukraine resistance. This is where the problem is.
Well, let me ask you about this tacit attack on free speech, and like try to situate it in time. So like we had this particular example of an attack on one author, by the Ayatollah, and the fatwa against him, and you know, good liberals around the world, especially Western liberals, you know, were appalled. That's true. Then, and you know, it might have been used, that kind of imagery and the fact of that might have been used to justify quite a lot of imperial and neoliberal actions around the world. But after 9/11, most of those same liberals did little, although it was better then than it is now, to oppose the tacit censorship or attack on free speech that arose after 9/11 through the Patriot Act, which was not only giving the state the power to extend surveillance but also specifically that what I recall was it gave the state the power to track what people were reading. They could go into libraries and find out what you've been checking out and things like that, which was a tacit form of censorship. It was saying, are you reading the wrong things? What are you reading? We want to keep track of you. And of course, that's only escalated since then in the West. And so I'm wondering, at what point do you think we might say of the West that it is no longer a tacit attack on free speech, but pretty much the same as Khomeini's? That's obviously rhetorical, but I'll let you respond to him.
So Orientalism as a category has expired itself in the West, and it didn't expire itself in the same time, especially after 2016. So, and going back to my article with sublation, when we talk about Orientalism, we're talking about one aspect of a system of othering that is used by central power. So in the 9/11 era, you would other Muslim, and after the long 2016, you would start othering the Trump voter, so on and so forth. And this is what I would try to talk about in the article, is that it's not about Orient and Occident and West. No, it's about how systems of power could make someone another, and create mass hysteria about it, although it could be something pretty much normal, like, winning an election or voting for someone that you don't like. So we can no longer talk about Orientalism per se as it is, although it came back powerfully, and Eurocentrism came back powerfully in the Ukraine war. But you can no longer talk about it as the main thing right now. The main thing now is using social justice to other people, to make them un-Western, to make them unmodern, to make them not exist in this world anymore, and to create a division. And this is where, to answer your question, this attack can become overt. It was overt during the Cold War against communist regimes that are in Eurasia. It was overt against Muslims in the war on terror. And now it's overt in the current war on terror. There is a writer called Mark Neocleos, and by the way, I am inspired by critical counterterrorism studies when writing. He said that in one of the documents of the Homeland Security Council on scenarios of attacks, they used the name the universal adversary, not Western, not Eastern, the universal adversary. Foreign terrorists, domestic radical groups, state-sponsored adversaries, and in some cases, disgruntled employees, disgruntled worker, class war on terror. So it is overt, but in the same time, my critique against I don't criticize all liberals. I don't criticize liberals, as I show in my article. I don't criticize liberals who criticize an attack on some author because of religion or because of his views on religion. I criticize falling into the consensus, the neoliberal consensus, because of that, and still saying that, no, I'm in the center, I'm not with this or with that. This is what I mainly criticize. And going back to the Salman Rushdie affair, I guess it was the genesis of the new atheists, some of the new atheists, like Christopher Hitchens, Bill Maher, who became defenders of the regime. And they believed that it's either capitalism, it's not either West or Orientalism or Orient, either capitalism or barbarism. This was their defeat, the defeat is that they stopped believing in capitalism as a contradiction. It could lead to barbarism, even in the most prosperous industrial capitalist liberal country, capitalism or barbarism, and they externalized the crisis.
Right.
And this is the problem. This is what I try to say. I am away from the division between left and between Orient and Occident, which is an identitarian division, and we're against that as we are against other identitarian divisions.
Yeah, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, quite a number, it had been happening before, but quite a number of Marxists or socialists or communists kind of gave up on the proletariat and on the socialist struggle. And some of them decided that the best that they could do was just try to hold on to the most progressive aspects of capitalist society. But the problem with that is whenever you try to chase after the most progressive aspects of capitalist society, you're always chasing after a contradiction. You're always going to be picking up, like Christopher Hitchens, you're going to be siding with the Bush administration, for Christ's sake. So
Just a second to go back to Said's thesis. I don't think Said wrote it to counter the West as a West. He wrote it to counter the local bourgeois, to counter the bourgeois West, but the local bourgeois at third world countries, who believed who were orientalizing their own populations and who were becoming more and more statist. And this is very important because I lost my track of thoughts, but this is what I wanted to talk about. That it wasn't a critique of the West or attack of the West, but it was a critique of the surrendering to the end of history that was happening in the third world also. So once again, I'm not thinking West East. I'm thinking about the stages of capitalism.
Some of the best things that Zizek have said in the last decade and a half or so, one of the best things is he said that we're all Fukuyamists now. He said this sort of, with despair. And what that means is that when you, I think what I would say, having talked to you, is that when we're all Fukuyamists, we all become theories of the Orient, theorists of the Orient. We all try to find the other to explain the contradictions in our society because we have no conception of how to get beyond it. So what we have to do is become an apologist for what is, and then find the rotten apple wherever it might be in our society or in the global society.
There is a Zizekian theory of the other that we all know about, which is the wife who slept with another man. She's the other. And even if I'm right, even if a war happened in Ukraine, even if there was a fatwa against an author, even if that's right, even if 9/11 was an attack on civil society, just like Spencer Leonard said once, I'm going to still view these events as a liberal, not as a westernized, no, as a liberal, as a neoliberal. I'm going to still view these events as in a pathological manner. I just remember something that I want to say is that, the problem with Orientalism, the problem with the products of Orientalism, Islamophobia, and all of that is that it is concerned with under capitalism, inviting or forcing 1 billion person Muslims into bourgeois society. But you're inviting them to a crisis because bourgeois society as it was in the 18th century does not exist anymore before the crisis of capitalism. And that is the problem with surrendering to the liberal end of history, is that, okay, you're condemning Muslims, you're condemning the Trump voter, you're condemning this and that, because they're not being included, or they're excluding themselves from a society that doesn't exist anymore, or that we think that exists, which is bourgeois society in the 18th, 19th century, or I don't know exactly, not a Marxiologist, where before the crisis of capitalism. And this is the crisis of contradiction that we're living in right now. And if the crisis is taking place at the center, at the capitalist center, how are we going to solve it globally? We're going to prepare a ready theory about the other, that you failed to join the bourgeois society because of you. It's your vulnerability. It's your problem. This is what Polish writer Mika Bukowski calls nesting Orientalism. I'm a Polish successful person from Warsaw, and I think people who live in the countryside of Poland, maybe on nearby the Russian border, as Orientals, Homo Sovieticus, as they represent the old regime. So this is the main problem. What I'm trying to sublime here is not to think about, once again, East or West, to think about how people are dealing and coping with and explaining late capitalism.
Great. And listen, what I want to do now, we've been talking for about 45 minutes. So I want to take a break. Do you have time for another session? We could talk more about wokeness.
The parrot room? Yeah,
the parrot room. Yeah. Okay, great.
Yeah, I'm a daily listener, so I know the formula.
Yeah, great. So we'll talk about, how woke this phenomena is. And I also want to go after you a little bit for your social conservatism, but without being woke. I'm going to see if I can do that. Because there's I thought I detected a touch of it.
Rabbi Amari said that I'm a Marxist, and you're saying that I'm a social conservative. So I'm gonna get hanged from different kind of actors for different kind of reasons.
Yeah. Well, I may be wrong. I want you to be a Marxist. So you know, and this won't be a struggle session. I'm
a platypus student. Is that good enough?
No, that doesn't count. I know Chris Patron personally.
I don't want to. This is the thing. I don't want to LARP Marxism. I think either you're a Marxiologist or a student of Marxiology.
Yeah, I called myself a wannabe. I called myself a wannabe Marxist for the longest time, and then I felt like maybe I was confident enough to just call myself a Marxist. Now I'm smarter than that. I think I'll start calling myself a wannabe.
There is only one Marxist, Chris Catron.
Oh, then no, I refuse to accept that as the answer.
I can't be a like. There's only one, and it's the last one. It's Chris Catron. Yeah,
that's too much. That's too much cult of personality for me. But listen, we'll talk in the parrot room.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.